Hey everybody, Tony D with another hot take, and this one's going to be about comic book stores. Are they closing? Is this the end of the comic book industry? Yellow Flash, also the Quartering had good videos on these subjects. You could check them out. For those of you who don't know, I was in comics for many years, still am, doing web comics. I wrote for the Simpsons comics, did over 60 issues of that. I had an Image story in Outlaw Territory. I did my own printed comics, Jersey Devil, The Travelers, The Fix. I wrote Evernights for Kenzer. Is that about it? I think there's one or two comics I'm forgetting. The web comics that got printed, like Lester Crenshaw is Dead, Post-Apocalyptic Nick, or Kickstarter. I've been in comics for over 20 years, and the comic book stores going out of business has been, pretty much a mantra ever since the crash after 94-ish, 93, 94. The thing is, comic book store guys, for the most part, aren't very good businessmen. They are big fans of the medium. It's often the comic book stores are opened by fans. A lot of times, the pattern I saw going around South Jersey and Philadelphia, you would see one of the workers take over the store after a few years, when the owner would get in financial trouble or he would just get sick of sort of squeaking by. He'd often sell out to one of his employees or his best employee, typically, and they would take over the store, or they would just go out of business and you'd never hear from them again. And I could rattle off dozens of stores that over the years I saw go out of business. A lot of times, part of the reason they went out of business is they ordered from their heart rather than their head. You have to understand, in business, location is everything. Okay, if you're not in a good location where there's a lot of comic book fans, like near a college, because college kids will read comics, or even near a high school or grammar school, it becomes tough. Now, if you're in Philadelphia, in just a good location in general, so Atomic Comics, for instance, that they lasted a long time. I don't even know if they're still in business, but they were on South Street, and that was a primo location for many years. And for a long time, they made great money. The problem is the state of comic books has been awful for a long time, a lot longer than the woke stuff that happens today. I mean, the woke stuff is awful, don't get me wrong, and you saw my video on the new Warriors. Just can't get over that one. And it's fun to make fun of them, but honestly, they were in trouble a long time before that in terms of their story and their quality. I remember when CrossGen came out, I was working for Kenzer, and we were doing all kinds of shows, and I had a great chat with the guys at CrossGen, or one of the guys from CrossGen, I forget his name, and one of my artist buddies, and we were just sitting around talking, and I was just like, and this was at the height of CrossGen. CrossGen was like, oh, we're going to talk movie deals, and we're talking about video games, and we're on the up and up, and we've got hired all these professionals, and they came down to Florida, and they're making comics, and I'm like, you're going to go out of business. And he was like, what? What are you saying? We've got all this money, and we're doing so great. And I go, yeah, but you're going out of business because you're not fulfilling a need in the marketplace, in my opinion. That wasn't the way to publish comics. They published like a bunch of different issues, single issues of various series, hoping to gain some kind of audience. And they did gain some kind of audience, but you can't spend $100,000 to make 5. There has to be a real demand. Now, how did Marvel do that back in the day? Marvel published comics like what was it, House of Mystery or Tales to Astonish and things like that. And those were anthology comics. So there'd be a couple of different stories, or there'd be different stories. Detective comics, there was different detectives. It was genre based rather than one holding on one particular character. So for detective comics, if people got bored of Batman, well, a different detective would come in. Now you don't have that. These trademarks are so important to the corporate guys, and they see them more as a can of peas, I think, than actual characters. They don't understand how this works organically from a creative perspective. You know, from a creative perspective, people get bored of stuff, and you have to mix it up. But you can't tell a suit, hey, you know, let's not have Batman in this issue. Let's just have him sitting at home. You know, he decides to stay at home because of the virus, and he's just watching TV in Gotham. You know, you can't sell that to a suit. And the suits basically set the tone in those big corporate companies, I believe. That's at least a feeling I get from talking to people I know who worked for DC and Marvel. The guys who are in charge are the money guys, and they're calling the shots, and they don't really care what the creatives think all that much. Yeah, they give them some leeway, but it's less and less. There was a time where editors held an important position, and they would fight for the creators because there was this idea, well, we need to insulate the creatives from the up and up. Now it's this weird mix. It's not even that anymore. It's not even the fight against the creatives and the suits. It's now the ideological conformity that's being handed down, I believe, because the perception is wokeness sells. Therefore, be woke, hire people who are woke, and we can't lose, right? Well, wrong. And in the case of Marvel and DC, they are now divisions of larger companies, and I've predicted their demise for years, that they're going to go into licensing because that's where they can't lose any money. You know, when it becomes like, well, we can't make any money here, okay, just license the characters. Let it be somebody else's headache. That's coming. I mean, eventually. You know, these guys... They're not making millions of dollars from comic book stores. They're just not. You have no further to look than the numbers. The hottest selling comic books, you know, they might crack 100,000. Back in the day, they cracked 200,000. And that was sold to comic book stores. You have to understand that's a comic book store sale. And also to dealers. You know, I go to these comic book conventions. There are guys, they roam the countryside, going to comic book show to comic book show, buying and selling comics. And they know what's hot and what's not. And they'll have an account at Diamond, or they'll order through their friend's account at a store to get the new books that they need. And they'll buy 50 copies of a hot comic just to get the cover. And then they'll sell that at a show and make their money back and maybe a little profit. And maybe they'll sell, you know, the single issues for $1 or sell them back to the store for 50 cents and just offset the cost, whatever. They all got these little schemes, but it's all like pennies. You know, you've got guys wheeling in deal for a couple bucks here and a couple bucks there. I mean, you're talking yard sale level, flea market kind of stuff. And I'm not saying that to disparage these guys. I know these guys, many of them are my friends, but I know this business. You know, I used to laugh when somebody would say, "Oh man, the tax man's coming." I go, "Well, somebody give him $2 and send him on his way." There'd be, I mean, you know, and for me, you know, being a comic book writer, I'd be lucky to make, you know, 30, 40, 50 bucks in a room that was just a one-day con, you know, and that basically pays for my, low battery, pays for my gas, pays for my lunch, and then maybe I walk away with 20 bucks. So it's economically not a viable thing anymore. So when you say that the comic book stores are going to close, yeah, a lot of them are going to close, but a lot of them are going to close anyway. And a lot of them will also stay open because they were vanity businesses to begin with. The people who run them weren't counting on the money. Some of them are. Some of them were, unfortunately, what this is going to do is going to punish the smarter businessmen in the comic book industry, because those guys were actually making money on the comics. You know, there are guys, they open stores and then they have a full-time job and they're running a store, and then they're going back to their job, and really their job keeps the store running. And their dream is to have the store do really well. And you know, comic books, like all kinds of collectibles, are cyclical. So when Superman died, people made money hand over fist. So a lot of these guys are just hanging on to hoping for days like that, hoping for a year of the death of Superman when everybody comes back to comics and starts buying stacks of them again. Will those days come? Doubtful, because the stories are, as they say in England, shite. And it all goes back to story. You know, as a writer, you may say, well, you're biased, you're a writer, you're obsessed with story. That's what drives the sales. Why did people care whether or not Superman died? Because that's a story. You know, his death would impact the entire DC universe. You know, he was instrumental in so many different things. That was a big deal. The death of Robin at the time was a huge deal. Now there are characters, if they died, you don't even know who these characters are. And a lot of times, if a character dies, it doesn't even matter, because there's no continuity anymore. There's nothing. If you don't continue what the previous art team and writer teams did in the past, then the continuity doesn't matter. And they threw out the continuity, 20 years ago, because they just got lazy, I think, in a lot of respects, or they just didn't care. They just didn't see the value in that. But there is a huge value in that, because there's a reason why there's a giant penny in the Batcave, and a Tyrannosaurus Rex, and all those other things that are in the Batcave. There was a story connected to all those trophies. But part of the reason is we've gotten so far away from a lot of those stories. It's hard for those to resonate. I mean, the giant penny, I believe the original story was published in like 1940 or 1939. So that's, obviously most readers are going to go, oh, I didn't even, what's the penny? I have no idea. I don't remember that story. So, but you hire a guy like me, I'll figure out a way to work in the penny again, or I'll come up with a cool new trophy to put in the Batcave, and we'll slowly phase out the other stuff, or push it into the background. But unfortunately, you have a lot of fanboys who run the comic book industry, not just in the stores, but also in the publishing arms. And these guys, they're just there to do what they always wanted to do. They always wanted to see, when they were sitting around the comic book store talking about their friends, wouldn't it be cool if the Hulk punched somebody so hard he went into space, or weird stuff like that. That isn't story based. You need writers. Basically what I'm saying is the comic book industry desperately needs good writing. Desperately. Yes, there's a handful of guys who are doing okay. And you have to understand, you can look at a good written comic that becomes popular and how the sales are driven. What a hot comic will do, it'll start high, it'll plummet, and by issue 10, they're talking about canceling it. What a reading comic will do is it'll start okay, maybe not great, and even go down a little bit, but then it'll start to rise. After about 3 or 4 months, it'll start to rise, because word will get around like, ooh, you got to read this is good. And then you'll look at the sales, and you'll see that the later issues are selling better than the previous issues, and it drives collectability, because the print runs on the earlier issues are lower. When you start at 50,000 and now the comic book's hot as hell, and you're printing 100,000 books, those earlier issues are worth more money. And that's the way you make a good selling comic that's healthy for the entire industry, the publisher and the store and the fans, because they get a better written story. The problem is, of course, none of this matters in these big corporate companies, I believe. They are essentially looking to shake out some IPs and then immediately turn them into TV shows if they're even a slightly bit popular, because they're desperate for content, and they're desperate for content with a fan base. And it's perceived that woke people and comic book fans are a just blindly loyal fan base that will watch anything, and that's simply not true. Marvel and DC, I believe, have killed their own fan base, more Marvel than DC, and there's going to be hell to pay. There's going to come a time when these woke people and the Marvel brand will be so toxic to fandom, they'll never buy it. And that day's coming. DC, I think, is probably in a slightly better position because they didn't quite go totally woke. The rumor is now they are, but I don't know. Maybe it'll be slightly better. Maybe they won't pull the trigger all the way. But at the end of the day, because they're branches of these huge companies, if we hit an economic recession, it's not going to be, oh no, the comic book store's closed. It'll be like, oh no, there are no more corporate comics anymore for them to even sell. And then all the stores will close. It won't just be, the guys who didn't plan for a rainy day or, didn't do mail order, or, a lot of guys I know, they're just doing online stuff. But the question is, do people even have money for that? And can you still make money buying and selling at comic book shows when everybody's out of work and, nobody can gather in more than groups of 10? We'll see what happens. I think ultimately something will survive the onslaught. I think there'll be probably some stores. There'll be collectible stores. They'll still be printing comics. And, if the direct market collapses and Diamond goes away, that might be a good thing. Because then maybe we can finally have a situation where we get comic books back in the stores that aren't just comic book stores. We could go back to going into head shops and weird places like body piercing and tattoo parlors. You could then, do comics that are more closely linked to the store that you're selling in. So, like I used to sell the Jersey Devil in Smithville, which is right next to Leeds Point, where the Jersey Devil was born, and we used to do pretty good. We used to sell some books there, and that was where it belonged. People could sell Western comics in a boot store or a leather shop. There's all sorts of ways you could do it, and that would maybe, in some respects, make those individual comic books stronger and the readership stronger, because they would be feeding in more directly to the people who want that stuff. So I don't look at this as an absolute disaster. I just look at it as a changing thing. Maybe this will be a boom for me in the webcomic factory. People will come to the webcomic factory because they can't get paper comics anymore. So and webcomics will become stronger still, and people will do more web-related stuff. Maybe finally Marvel and DC will realize that charging $4 for a digital download is too much money, and after the comic book stores close, or enough of them, they'll lower their prices to $1, which is about the price point I would put a digital download, and then lower the paper comics to $2, or finally do what I say is do anthology comics and just publish like 3 or 4 of them, a month, just one a week. Be more than enough for people if it was a nice thick book. You got 120 pages. Yeah, sign me up. That could be something that could be fun. But of course, you're probably still going to have to fire all these woke idiots who are ruining comics, because they're not helping, and they're against capitalism anyway. So send them off to a commune, maybe an artist collective, and see how well they do there.